Today we're going to talk about culture. Culture is the totality of learned, socially transmitted behavior. It includes the ideals, values, customs of groups of people. A fairly large number of people are said to constitute a society when they live in the same territory, are relatively independent of people outside their area, and participate in a common culture. Members of a society share a common language, which facilitates day-to-day exchanges. Your authors define culture as the ways of thinking, the ways of acting, and the material objects that together form a people's way of life. Culture has two basic components: the non-material culture, or the ideas created by members of a society, and material culture, the physical things created by members of a society. Together, these two components describe a people's way of life. Culture also plays an important role in shaping human personality. When we think about material culture, we're talking about the physical or technological aspects of our daily lives, including our food items, houses, factories, and raw materials, the architecture, the buildings, the cell phones, the clothing. All of those tangible aspects make up our material culture. Our non-material culture, on the other hand, refers to the ways of using material objects and to customs, beliefs, philosophies, governments, and patterns of communication. When we think about non-material culture, we're very often talking about our values and our beliefs. We can define values as the culturally defined standards that people use to decide what is desirable, what is good, what is beautiful, and which serve as broad guidelines for social living. Values are broad principles that underline beliefs, which are specific statements or ideas that people hold to be true. Your author discusses 10 key values of United States culture, including equal opportunity, achievement and success, material comfort, activity and work, practicality and efficiency, progress, science, democracy, freedom, and democracy. Oh, I said democracy already. Our belief systems are, again, they underlie values, and beliefs can refer from anything to one's belief in a higher being to fantasy beliefs, our belief in extraterrestrial life, if you will. So these are the two dimensions of culture, and then we want to talk about a third dimension of culture, if you will, the behavioral dimension of culture, which falls into the normative dimension. Norms can be defined as rules and expectations by which a society guides the behavior of its members. There are a variety of different types of norm. We have both formal and informal norms. Formal norms have generally been written down and involve strict rules for punishment of violations. Informal norms are generally understood but are not precisely recorded. An example of an informal norm would be a folkway. These are norms for routine and casual interaction. For example, a gentleman or a woman holding a door open for an incoming person. Not passing gas on an elevator might be an example of a folkway. No one's going to throw you in jail for doing that, but you may be looked at funny. Mores, on the other hand, are norms that are deemed to be highly necessary to the welfare of a society. They are widely observed. They have great moral significance because they embody cherished principles of a culture, of a people. For example, in terms of norms, in United States culture and most cultures across the world, murder is something. Taking someone else's life would be considered morally deviant and not appropriate in most cases. In some cases, for example, war or justifiable homicide, it's okay. But that would be an example of a violating a more, if you will, if you were to murder someone or kill someone. Mores oftentimes are encoded in law, and laws would be considered the most formal types of norms that we do have. And a folkway would be considered the most informal type of norm that we have. And so all of the norms provide a guideline for the behavioral dimension of culture. So when we think about culture, we very often think about mainstream culture, a culture that we all share within a society. But within that, we also have subcultures. All groups, no matter what their size, have their own values, norms, and sanctions. And sanctions are the punishments that result from violating a norm. Most groups that we can belong to are microcosms of the larger society, and as such, we might consider them a subculture. Your authors define subculture as cultural patterns that set apart some segment of a society's population, or smaller groups within that particular society can make up a subculture. A subculture would have the elements of a culture. It would share some aspects of the larger culture, but would have some distinct differences, some sets of beliefs, values that are shared in common with members of that particular group. Each subculture is a world within the larger culture, or the larger dominant culture. A subculture may have a distinctive way of looking at life. There are thousands of subcultures in the United States. For example, we might consider there to be a youth subculture. There may be a bodybuilding subculture. Ethnic groups sometimes have their own subcultures. Occupations may share subcultures. If you think about your high school life, within that larger mainstream culture of the high school, there were subcultural groups: the cheerleaders, the football team, the athletes, the band geeks, if you will. The people who were very smart might make up aspects of a subculture within the larger, broader culture, mainstream culture of the high school. Countercultures are somewhat opposite. They have cultural patterns that strongly oppose those widely accepted within a society. For example, some biker gangs deviant biker gangs at least, may be considered to be a counterculture, or people who worship Satan, or some militia groups might be considered to be aspects of a counterculture. So taking these things into mind, these elements and concepts that help us to understand a little bit about what culture and subcultures are, I thought it might be interesting to share and talk a little bit about FAMU culture. I know that within your college orientation courses, you do learn a little bit about the history, or maybe thoroughly about the history of FAMU. So I'm going to read a little bit to you from a book called Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, A Centennial History. This book was written by Liddell Neeland, and I want you to look out for, as I'm reading, look out for some elements of culture that we've talked about, the non-material aspects, the material aspects, the normative aspects of culture, and see if we can identify them in FAMU. The site chosen for the school was west of Tallahassee on a commanding hill, which now is the home site of Florida State University. It was equipped with 50 wooden desks, purchased at a cost of $2.90 each. Instructional aids such as charts, maps, globes, and dictionaries were secured for the total cost of $61.17. Attorney Thomas DeSalle Tucker, a graduate of Oberlin College, who was then 43 years of age, was chosen as the first president. According to schedule, both the State Normal College for colored students at Tallahassee and the State Normal College for white students at Defuniak Springs opened Monday, October 3, 1887. The enrollments were nearly equal as possible, the white school reporting 16 pupils and the Negro school 15. These new institutions were designed to provide advanced training for the teachers of Florida. In consequence, admission was restricted to persons 16 years of age and over. Recognizing the insufficient educational attainment of many of the applicants, it was deemed necessary to examine all newcomers and place them in categories on the basis of the scores received. Of the 15 who registered and took examinations on the first day, only 6 were qualified to do the work in the normal department, and some of this number were entered conditionally. Most of the students did not appear until after farm work had been completed in the fall, or until after the rural school near them had concluded its term. Although only 52 students enrolled during the first year, there were 35 in average daily attendance, kind of similar to today. Since state-supported housing was non-existent, boarding students were forced to accept accommodations with private families. This restricted enrollment considerably because many parents objected to sending their girls away from home and placing them in strange households. Although the college did not charge an entrance fee, many of those who came were unable to take care of the simple matter of food and lodging without an appropriate opportunity for work. Realizing this fact, Tucker early conceived and presented to the Board of Education a plan designed to aid students, thereby increasing attendance. It was his condition that in order that students may draw to the institution without misgivings on the part of the patrons relative to their habits and morals while away from home, and also to enable indigent students to partly defray their expenses by manual labor, the college should be removed to the country and located on a 30-acre piece of land and supplied with dormitory buildings, which explains how FAMU moved from where Florida State is now to the highest of 7 hills that we enjoy so much. So those are the beginnings of FAMU, and here on the PowerPoint side you see a early picture of Coleman Library. I want to share a little bit more with you about the early days of FAMU, some values and belief systems, if you will. From the inception of the institution, it was the expressed desire of each administrator that all students would develop qualities of leadership, initiative, cooperativeness, and industry, along with a high degree of intellectual competence. It will be recalled that the major argument used by President Tucker in 1889 for moving the college from the city of Tallahassee to a farm adjacent to the city was to obtain media by which work opportunities might be provided for indigent students. Once the change had been made to a more rural setting, the administration initiated the policy of requiring all students, regardless of financial position, to work 1 hour per day or its equivalent without remuneration, meaning without pay, and to take a course each semester in the incidental industries. Girls were given opportunities to satisfy their work requirements in what President Tucker preferred to call housewifery by processing milk and making butter at the dairy, by canning, sewing, and in other avenues provided in domestic science. Boys found a wider variety of outlets on the farms, in the agricultural barn, and in the various industries which were conducted by the Industrial Arts Department. So in the early days of FAMU, and next we'll see a picture of the old FAMC hospital, which is where now the Foot-Hillier Administration Building is. But in the early days of FAMU, it was required that students work without pay to give back to the institution as well as to defray their own costs. Maybe a policy we might think about again. All right, let's look at some other guidelines that the university administrators provided to students as early as 1887. From the outset, the administration had adopted policies designed to encourage scholarship with a minimum of distractions. Professor Gibbs, who was also the secretary for the college during President Tucker's administration, sent out literature to prospective students informing them of the institution's regulations and expectations related to students who enrolled. Prospective students were told that they should be plain and no one should bring more clothing than necessary for cleanliness and health. Neatness, not gaud and glitter, was given as the standard. The first two presidents, Tucker and Young, believed that strict supervision of students was absolutely essential for proper social and moral development. Students were required to abstain from all social or public gatherings held at night, except by express permission of the president. They were required to spend their entire evening hours in their dormitories in study. Exceptions were sometimes made for students in good academic standing to participate in social and other innocent recreation on Friday evenings with the knowledge and consent of the president. Feeling that an idle mind is the devil's workshop, the early administrators prohibited idling on the streets or around places of questionable character. Students were also prohibited from drinking intoxicating liquors, smoking tobacco in any form, gambling, or firearms. All students were required to pledge before admission unqualified submission to those regulations that the school enforced. Punishment for violations to those regulations were given by demerits. 5 demerits were given for 1 warning or mark, 10 for 2 warnings or marks, and 15 demerits in any one session made a student liable for suspension. So what do you think a typical day was like for a FAMU student? An early FAMU student, let's say about 1903. Well, this book, The Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, A Centennial History, again written by Liddell Neeland, who is a retired professor of FAMU. The book provides details on what life was like for a student in approximately 1903. This is the day in the life of a student, 1903. And our next picture is a picture from 1914 of FAMU students and instructors with tennis equipment. But 1903, typical day of a student. 5:30 a.m. A large bell, which could be heard at a considerable distance, was rung. It was commonly called the farm bell, but to the students it was the rising bell. The assistant matron in the girls' dormitory emphasized that it was the rising hour by walking through the corridors ringing a large handbell. Every girl was expected to arise and shine and prepare for breakfast. 6:15 a.m. The first breakfast bell was rung. 6:30 a.m. The second bell was rung. At the sound of this bell, all girls assembled in the study hall, a large room in the girls' dormitory, and led by the matron sang the morning hymn, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. After the singing of this hymn, the girls went down to the dining hall, stood behind their respective seats, and waited for the incoming of the boys. Meanwhile, the boys, having heard their captains fall in, were assembled in front of their dormitory and were drilled over to the dining hall. They took their stand behind chairs on opposite sides from the girls. A teacher stood at the end of each table. A table bell was sounded as a signal for all to sing the morning blessing, Come at the morning hour, come let us kneel and pray. After the blessing, all sat to a breakfast of grits, bacon, hash or eggs, tea, coffee, biscuits, butter, and skimmed milk. After a half an hour in the dining hall, a bell was sounded for dismissal of students. Boys were dismissed first. Girls went to their rooms and prepared themselves for morning inspection. Any girl going to class without having left her room in order was called from the class to complete the cleaning of the room. At 8 a.m., classes began. At noon, morning classes were dismissed. 12:30 p.m., dinner was served. Dinner in the South very often really is the lunch meal, but it's often phrased as dinner. So at 12:30 p.m., dinner was served. Boys strolled over for dinner. The dinner blessing was, "Thou art great, thou art good, and we thank thee for this food. By thy hand we must all be fed. Give us, Lord, our daily bread." The menu for dinner was rice with either beef stew or fish, greens, peas or white beans, stewed tomatoes, and cornbread. Whenever vegetables were the main dish, they were served topped by slices of boiled bacon. Dessert was served Sundays and Wednesdays, gingerbread on Wednesdays, cottage pudding on Sunday. 2 p.m. afternoon classes began. From 4 to 5:30, supper was served. The blessing sung at this meal was "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." The menu was light bread, butter, syrup, tea, and preserves on Wednesdays and Sundays. At 7 p.m., the bell rang for study hour. All girls were expected to answer to the roll call in the study hall. Upper-class students were allowed the privilege of returning after roll to their rooms to study. Others studied under the supervision of a teacher until 9 o'clock, when all girls went to their rooms to prepare for bed. 9:30 p.m. was curfew. The large outside bell was rung, and the matron's handbell was rung. The bugle was blown outside the boys' dormitory, and the night watchman was happy to sing out, "Lights out." All lights in rooms were supposed to be extinguished. Oftentimes, the night watchman would have to call from under a window to remind a girl that it was past time for her lights to be burning. Usually the day was over at 9:30 p.m. On every corridor there was a teacher who was required to insist on order in the corridor. She would usually walk to each door to make sure that the students of the room were quietly tucked into bed. And finally, just a little glimpse into student life on FAMU's campus from about 1949 to about 1969. A little bit of information. There were some strict rules during this particular time. Failure to observe the rules and regulations would result in a one-way ticket home. Curfew for students was 5 p.m. It eventually moved to 6 p.m. and considerably later after the late 1960s and 70s. All students were required to attend Vesper and assembly programs, and attendance was checked for freshmen and sophomore. A student with 3 recorded cuts could be sent home after a hearing by the dean of students or his designee. Women students were not expected to ride in cars with male students and could not wear shorts or jeans on the campus until Saturdays. So, early FAMU culture for FAMU students, what seemed to be very, very restrictive. When we think about the freedoms that we have, that FAMU students have today, the typical day in the life of a FAMU student clearly is vastly different than it was for the students from 1903. What I would like you to do is think about, based on the information that's been presented, specifically about early FAMU cultures, to think a little bit about some of the elements of culture. What were some of the material dimensions of culture, early FAMU culture, that were discussed? What were some of the non-material dimensions of early FAMU culture? The normative dimension, what behaviors were expected? What were the value systems and belief systems expected of FAMU students and expected by the administrators? And how does that compare with FAMU culture today in terms of our non-material and material and normative dimensions of culture? That concludes our lecture, our discussion on FAMU culture. If you have any questions, please send me an email and let me know so I can provide some answers to you. Thank you.